Welcome to this presentation on the kitchen garden tradition at the Barony Rosendal in Norway. My name is Annegret Dietze, and I'm a professor at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences near Oslo. Since 2020, I oversee the park projects at the Barony. In this presentation, I will begin with, let me see, it's not moving. Yes, now. I will begin with a brief introduction to the site's context before focusing on the three most significant historical layers of the kitchen gardens. I will then share updates on the recently completed and ongoing projects and conclude with a few thoughts and questions about the future directions for the kitchen gardens. The Barony Rosendal is located on the west coast of Norway, around a 2-hour drive from Bergen. To begin, I'd like to remind you that garden art and cultural development are deeply influenced by politics and specific context of the time, including the people involved. From the 14th to the 19th century, during the period when the barony was established, Norway was part of Denmark and governed by the Danish king. And for most of the 19th century, Norway came under Swedish rule. And it wasn't until 1905 that the country gained independence. This historical context is important because it explains why Norway lacks the extensive royal parks and gardens found in Denmark, Sweden, and other European countries. In Norway, the societal layer that had the greatest influence on garden art during the period when the barony was established was comprised of merchants, ships owners, and wealthy civil servants. So this group plays a crucial role, and their contributions remain our primary source for studying garden art and culture from this era. The manor house, or little castle, situated between the impressive mountains on one side and the Hardangerfjord on the other, is a typical example of its time and context. The first owners and founders were Karen Movat, the daughter of a wealthy Norwegian family, and the Danish Ludvig Rosenkrantz. The work with the manor began around 1662 and was completed by 1665. This estate reflects a transition from Renaissance styles or ideals to the emerging Baroque style. Today, the barony primarily showcases the remnants of a 19th century landscape. Here you can see the main entrance with the impressive Malmanger mountain serving as a dramatic backdrop. In the past, the owners and visitors always arrived by boat, as it was the fastest and safest way to connect with key Norwegian and international business partners and family members. The main entrance was connected to the harbor via a tree-lined avenue. Thanks to the sea routes, garden owners had easy and direct access to developments in other European countries and cultures. This facilitated the adoption of new garden styles, plant use, and gardening techniques, which were quickly adapted to suit Norwegian conditions, needs, and interests. Norwegian gardens clearly demonstrate a pragmatic approach to integrating new styles into their own context and possibilities, while still maintaining an interesting artistic flair. Here you see the old smithy in the landscape park, established in the second half of the 19th century. And here a folly located in the landscape park. We will now move on to the first layer of the kitchen gardens. Parallel with the manor house, the first garden at Rosendal was established already in 1666 and 1667. Orders and bills mentioned both seeds, gardener tools, and fish for a fish pond. This list here shown from the 1667 mentions mainly vegetables like carrot, cabbage, Savoy cabbage, cauliflower, onions, kale, turnip, pumpkin, cucumber, beetroot, various lettuces, and artichokes, or herbs such as sage, chervil, basil, and thyme. I'm also including a picture of Kara Movat, the first female owner, as we believe that her role in designing and developing the garden has been underrepresented in previous research. While we do not have a precise plan of the original layout, we are fairly confident that this sketch of a plan reflects the design of the very first 17th century garden. It shows the manor house on the right and the garden on the left, featuring 11 square beds and a small pavilion in the corner of the 12th bed. At the center of the garden, there's a small fountain, and the entire garden was enclosed by a stone wall. The main approach to the garden is marked by an avenue on the top, which according to other sources may have been lined with walnut trees. Additionally, archival materials suggest that the edges of the garden beds were bordered with boxwood, buxus. Research conducted in the 1990s has shown that these bed edges I marked here have survived into the present days. Here I'm standing between two of the boxwood edges in 2005. DNA analysis conducted by Professor Dagvin Moe and Per Harald Halvesen from the University of Bergen have confirmed that these surviving boxwood varieties date back to the 17th century. At one point in history, most of the boxwood edges were replaced by grass, but some sections preserved and the trimming was stopped. This means that these hedges originally framed an extensive kitchen garden within the walled first formal garden at the barony. Now, let's move on to the second historical layer of the kitchen garden in the 18th century. In 1745, Edvard Lonneman took over the barony. From this time, we have a few but significant documents preserved in the archive. One example shown here lists what was sown in the garden in April 1746. We can observe a repetition of the vegetables and herbs from the 17th century lists with some additions, including a wider variety of fruit trees and a few ornamental plants. On the right of this slide, you can see a plan of the house and the garden from 1786. In this plan, is shown that 9 of the original 11 formal beds were still dedicated to growing vegetables and herbs, while only 2 beds seem to have been designed by for ornamental purpose, highlighted here with red oval. The manor house is again depicted on the right-hand side of this plan. Before we move on to the third and final layer of the kitchen garden, I'd like to share another interesting record from the archive. This document provides a simple overview of the formal garden from the period between 1815 and 1820. It outlines a crop rotation plan for 6 years, with each formal bed being used for different crops. I've zoomed in on one specific example, showing the following sequence. In 1815 and 1816, rye grain, followed by potatoes in 1817, peas in 1818, and finally strawberries in 1819 and 1820. Other vegetables or useful plants mentioned in the crop rotation plan included kohlrabi, cauliflower, kale, carrots, turnips, Savoy cabbage, parsnips, beets, pole beans, and cucumber. So it is interesting to note that the formal garden primarily served as a source for food supply, also in the beginning of the 19th century. It was not until around the 1830s that dedicated ornamental flower beds began to be created in the garden. Here pictures of some of the introduced ornamental plants mentioned in 1834. In the mid-19th century, a new chapter began with the third layer of kitchen gardens. Marcus Gerhard Hoff Rosenkrone inherited the estate following his father's death and embarked on a major transformation of the entire property starting in 1849. Marcus Gerhard Hoff Rosenkrone passed away in 1896, leaving behind a map from 1893, which likely served as a record of his life's work. This map provides a glimpse of what he has accomplished since the 1850s. The manor house is highlighted with a red circle here, and the park itself was developed in stages over time. First, Marcus Gerhard removed the wall around the formal garden, reduced the number of square beds, and opened the garden to the surrounding landscape. The red lines here indicate the boundaries of the original formal garden and shows the 2 beds that he removed. This is how the formal garden appeared after the transformation. Of the remaining 7 formal beds, only 2 were dedicated to ornamental plants, while the remaining beds were still used for kitchen and vegetable cultivation. 2 pictures from the 1864 and 1870 illustrate how the formal garden looked at that time. You can see the bed edges of grass and fruit trees planted within. Also in the 1850s, as one of the first projects, Hoff Rosenkrone established a large kitchen garden. The kitchen garden is located right next to the main entrance to the barony, as you can see with the red arrow. All guests who arrived at Rosendal could not avoid noticing it. There were viewpoints down to the fjord, a pavilion, greenhouses placed directly across from the main gate to the barony, as well as cold frames, hotbeds, areas with berries, fruit trees, and to the left, along the wall, a large nursery. Here you can see the view from the highest point in the kitchen garden that is offering a glimpse over the beds and greenhouses stretching out to the fjord and the surrounding landscape. The 1893 map reveals that the entire park was dotted with fruit trees, seamlessly integrated among ornamental trees and flower beds. The name displayed on the map correspond to various types of fruit trees planted throughout the park. An espaliered orchard lined a large wall, which is highlighted and zoomed in here. The fruit trees are no longer there, but the area and the walls remain in the park, waiting for the next restoration project. The park featured a wide variety of pear trees alongside apples, cherries, plums, peaches, apricots, and other more exotic species. Having a wide variety of fruit trees was crucial for a large household like the barony. This strategy ensured a steady supply of fruits throughout the entire season and year. Additionally, it helped mitigate risks. With different varieties blooming at different times, the garden was better protected against the potential impacts of adverse weather, such as late frosts and heavy rain during the flowering period. The results of the fruit harvest are documented in the barony's records. The variety and quantity of the different sorts are impressive, with thousands and thousands of liters of fruit harvested every year. The fruits and vegetables that were not used in the barony's household were sold at the market in Bergen. Now let's turn to the current status and ongoing projects. Between 2000 and 2005, the kitchen garden from Marcus Gerhard, also the 19th century kitchen garden, was restored based on maps and records from Hoff Rosenkrone's time, with a focus on preserving the original layout and selecting historically accurate plans. One of the garden beds is dedicated specifically to showcasing plants from the 17th and the 18th century seed lists. The idea was to give visitors an idea of the plant variety that would have been present in the former walled garden before Hof Rosenkrone transformed the estate. Around 2000, also the greenhouses were restored. They are today used as a cafe and for storing potted plants during the winter. Here's an image taken inside one of the greenhouses. Since 2020, we have conducted and initiated several restoration projects across all gardens, as well as the entire park and landscape. This slide shows the restoration of the stone wall along the kitchen garden with before and after images in the 19th century garden. In the 19th century, this area close to the wall was home to the plant nursery. Another project focused on the renewing of the garden beds with the mentioned plant examples from the 17th and 18th century lists. So we are still in the 19th century garden part. And these final images highlight the current state of the formal garden close to the little castle. Today, the formal beds from the 17th and 18th century are planted with diverse selections of roses, which are not historically accurate to this garden. The upper image shows a garden map from around 1960, illustrating that vegetables were grown here alongside fruit trees until that time. To conclude, the kitchen garden tradition at the Barony Rosendal has a long and rich history, far more extensive than what I have presented here today. From today's perspective, it is difficult to fully understand its depth as a visitor. One must therefore ask, what is the future of the kitchen garden at the Barony Rosendal? Should the kitchen garden be reintegrated into the formal garden? Can we utilize the extensive plant lists from all three historical layers? How can the kitchen garden tradition play a larger role in today's activities and outreach efforts? And could it function as a gene bank for plants suited to Nordic conditions and needs? Isn't the ongoing cultivation and knowledge sharing of kitchen garden traditions also a key element in today's discussions on food security and sustainable agricultural practices? But what happens then to the narrative of the rose garden in Rosendal? Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you so much. What a wonderful picture. What a wonderful picture. This is sunset. Yeah. It's amazing. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much, Annegret. Thank you. Very interesting. And let's say you have raised a number of questions that would be interesting to discuss in the group now. So, who is going to start?
Maybe I can start.
Great.
I was wondering if Norway has a tradition of kitchen gardening, like in England and France and Holland, you see there's a lot more interest in kitchen gardening over the past 10, 20 years. Is it the same in Norway? Would that be something you could use to restore the kitchen garden, or at least start a discussion about that?
I would say, I mean, there had been several restoration projects the past 20 years, I would say. The challenge is that the cost, the resources for maintaining such gardens is not always lined up together with restoration projects. That means that we have not really so many good examples, I would say, for kitchen gardens restored, because you have done these complex issue about money, resources, and how to maintain it over the years, right? So this is not really solved, but I guess, I mean, there are several initiatives starting, as also Joachim mentioned, in steps, so that we see how can this develop over time. But I guess we are a bit behind other projects, and for instance, Gunnebo is a kind of model for us. We are traveling to Sweden quite often to see what they have done the past 20 years.
And is there a tradition in Norway of people volunteering to work in a kitchen garden?
In gardens in general, but it is not that strong than in the UK, for instance. I have to say it, but there are initiatives. There are these kind of groups, friend of the gardens, or rose associations, or garden associations. So there are, but you cannot really compare it like what we have in the UK, for instance.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
What's the ownership of the who is the owner of the garden?
It is a foundation that is a kind of owner here, but it is a foundation under the University of Oslo. It's a bit complicated. The last private owner gave the barony to the University of Oslo, and then they made a foundation under the university. So it is a kind of independent entity, but related to University of Oslo.
Thank you. Thank you. Mike?
What is the population density around the area where the gardens are? Is it quite dense, or is it quite a remote site?
It is very remote, yeah.
Yeah. It's one of the loveliest examples of community-supported agriculture we saw recently was in Holland, where the social aspects of the community being involved in community-supported agriculture is really, really noticeable and important. But that's difficult in a remote area. Yeah. Thank you.
At least for the daily involvement, I would say it's very difficult. But I mean, the barony is in Norway. It's like a little cultural center, because in the summer season, also they start really the opening and activities in May, and this lasts until end of August, September. So, and then you have there's a gallery, so art exhibitions, there are concerts, there's sometimes theater, then there's a little bed and breakfast attached that is also maintained or run by the barony. So there are visitors coming and staying for a couple of days and then leaving again. So as I said, we have Bergen quite close, and then also some even international tourists. So I know during the season we have like 10,000 visitors half a year, as I said, which is for the location for the site quite impressive, actually.
Yeah. Because the growing season is quite short then too, compared to the example in Holland. Thank you.
Alex? Alex?
Il y a une question. Oui, il y a une question de Mathieu Constant qui demande s'il y a des programmes de conservation des espèces potagères locales. Et je voudrais compléter cette question par le fait de savoir où est-ce que vous vous fournissez de vos graines potagères.
Is there someone with a translation?
Did you get it? Angret? So the question is about where do you buy your seeds? Where do you buy your seeds? Do you have yeah, that was the question.
There's this from the region. Also, this is Bergen, or we have also very close some plant nurseries that we can use for that.
Alex, can you let's say if my question was not complete, can you complete it in English on the English channel?
I cannot hear any
Est-ce que là,
translation.
c'est mieux si je suis sur le bon canal?
Which channel are you? Which channel are you, Alex?
I
English?
can, I can speak in French?
On the English channel, yes.
Ah,
But
for English.
which channel are you?
Have you programs of conservation for the kitchen species, for the different vegetables? And if not, where do you find your seeds?
Is that a question about the historical correct varieties?
Mhm.
Yeah, that's a tricky question because what we do today is that we try to find what we can find on the market, right? So there are often modern both seeds, but also fruit trees. So, but what we, if I understand your question correct, what we try to do, we wish to start planting fruit trees again based on the historical correct varieties, cultivars. So this is the first step we wish to continue with now. Also, because we see that the knowledge about, as a first, the sources, the original plants that we still have in the region or even Norway, they disappear more and more, and also the knowledge attached to that, because people, the generation changes, and the people just yeah, it's really, it's hard work, because to be very honest, since Norway discovered oil in the 60s and 70s, they finished to think about producing their own food and to be independent in a way. So we lost a lot of knowledge, yeah, since the 60s, 70s. So this is now one generation. So we have to go back before 50s and find, or 60s, and find the knowledge again. For instance, for growing vegetables, doing all this stuff independent of historical sites and places, right?
Mm.
That's my interpretation. If there's someone from Norway here, you can shut me down, but this is at least how I see it from my perspective, and how I have researched on that and tried to find out what the reason is.
Where are you going to buy your fruit trees?
That has to be a collaboration with gardener schools, people who have the knowledge. We have mapped partly remaining original or old species. So we have to do it by our own. We have to collaborate in a good way here, yes. Because we wish to, it's so easy to say, oh, let's go to Denmark, let's go to Sweden, let's go to somewhere and buy, or even UK, buy this. But I think it's nice to start locally and then see what we need to buy maybe externally. We will see. This is a long process.
Yeah, Kirsten?
Hello, Annegret. I've got a question. Do you have, I'm really interested, do you have positive effects of the climate change um, in Norway? That when you compare it with the historic informations you get, because you're told about the thousands of peers you read about, and I'm really interested if you see during the years there's an effect that you have a longer term of the vegetation for the vegetation in autumn, for example.
Yes and no. Of course, we have a longer season now compared to former times, but at the same time, we get new and different plant disease. We are a bit nervous about the Gulf Stream and what happens there. So I would not say this is really an advantage for us, the climate change. But of course, I mean, yeah, the season is longer, which makes it a bit easier. And also for the what we see from the records, from the archive, there was much more effort and resources used to move plants during wintertime inside houses, right? This is not necessary in the same way anymore, for instance, because it is milder. The winter is milder, but again, it is not really good for the park. As we see, for instance, it's much more heavy rain now compared to what we had earlier, which then again has a consequence when fruit trees flowering, for instance, or so you get lots of damage and other issues in addition. So.
Michelle, there's a question in the Q&A.
Yeah.
A French question by Mathieu Constant.
Yes, he's asking whether you have a program of conservation of local vegetable species. So would that be Norwegian, Scandinavian?
Not yet.
I don't know if you could be in touch with the Heritage Seed Library in Britain. You might have been in touch with them.
I mean, what we have in Norway is there are programs for with the focus on gene, also original plants or plants adapted or suitable for the Nordic climate in a way, also gene banks, seed banks. So there is a lot going on. The challenge I see partly is that this is often related to these large-scale agricultural production, and we are talking about a kind of niche here. Which is then not covered enough because there's not this economic interest in it than in large production of crops or whatever. So, but we are trying to define us into this program so that we can make use of it in a way, because I think, as I said at the end, I think what we are doing here and discussing here is part of this food security discussion in the world. So I think they should highlight that a bit more also in these type of programs.
Joachim?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to say that in Sweden we have this has been kind of well organized by the Agricultural University in a program for diversity of cultivated plants, and they've been collecting for I think 15 years or so, collecting historical and local varieties. So in Sweden now we have some old varieties that has been saved and documented and collected. So perhaps if you stretch out of Norway, there are a close neighbor, and there's some old varieties still exist here in that program. And then I had another question as well, and that is there a full-time gardener working at Rosendal or all year around on a long-term basis now? Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah, and I know, of course, our Swedish colleagues. So I knew also I know the program and the efforts there. But as I said, in all, we do not have that at this stage. So that's something where we should reach out and see how we can collaborate in a good way, and maybe even through some Nordic projects, because I know there are some collaboration grants that we could use to do that. By the way, yes, there is. There are during the whole year, yes, there are, I'm quite unsure now, they have at least 3 persons, but not all fully employed. One, so I guess it's 2.5 together, maybe, during the whole year. But then we have seasonal workers coming. The first come in March, and then the last they are leaving in September, October-ish, I think. And it's very crowded in the summer because, as you can imagine, there's so many people coming and you have to do, and then of course because of the season, so there's lots of things to do during the season. So there are several, I think we had like 20, 30, 40, it depends a bit because it's also overlapping with the cafe and with the guided tours, and so they are not clearly gardeners then in the season. They have to jump a bit through positions and work. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Lucy?
Sorry, there's another question in the Q&A.
Okay.
Is there a list of fruit varieties resistant and adapted to the climate?
Yeah.
That's
Are
it.
there fruits,
Mhm.
species and varieties more adapted to the climate? Yeah, that's right.
That's a good question. I have not really a good overview. I know that there are several also research institutes working on that. Again, I'm not such because I approached them several years ago and asked them for help for these historical names I have on my map from 1893, for instance. And they were not really interested in looking into that because they have a focus on large-scale fruit production, also these orchards for, yeah, supermarkets and whatever. So that might, also this was before the pandemic, so this might have changed again. So I can approach them again. And I'm very sure they have a list where they also test these kind of modern varieties for climate adaptation and other disease issues and so on. But I'm not so interested in that. I would love to look into my list of apple names, for instance, and pears and plums and whatever I have. I have it with all the details I need. And we checked that several years ago, maybe half of it's still existing somewhere in the world. So, but only maybe 10% is still available in Norway, for instance. So what we wish to do is to maybe expand or see if we can collect some of these names and fruit trees again in the park as a gene bank, as a and then to test again how good are they now for climate issues or new disease and so on.
When you showed some peers and you with the names, what kind of let's say what kind of peers does it correspond to? Is it peers that were cultivated in there, or is it peers that you plan to cultivate again? Or?
These were references, just a few references that we have in the historical records, and where I also found pictures or that they still are in use. But this was just a little tiny part of the large list.
Because these peers, let's say the names of many look very, very familiar.
Yes. So this is the more common, and some of them are still in production. I mean, we have it also in Norway. Some of these historical varieties are in production, of course. Yes. And then it's easy. But I'm a bit interested in the more, these gray zones there we don't have access to anymore.
Yeah. Kerstin?
Annegret, is there no volunteer association in Norway for historic seeds?
There is one, yes. And we have collaboration with them, but they are, I mean, there's yes, and we have also association working on historical rose varieties, for instance. So there are a few, but yes.
Yeah. In your presentation, you mentioned these different layers of the garden, and that's actually that happens in many gardens to have several layers. How do you prioritize these layers? I have the feeling that you prioritize the most recent one, but how do you let's say how do you give visibility to the other layers also?
This is what we need to do now, actually, in the next step. But this also because as you have seen correctly, the last layer from the 1850s to the 1900s approximately, it's the most present now, and it is also the main reason why this park is preserved, because you get this kind of, yeah, as Joachim also introduced, this Vermeone, also this kind of that you have the park, also the smaller garden, the park, the kitchen garden, and then the landscape, the agricultural landscape around that was a kind of concept, the whole thing. So this is highlighted in the description of the preservation for this garden. But at the same time, since the castle is from the 17th century, and we also have the layout, at least the size and the layout still from the 17th century, this is also important to take care of, or to highlight in a way. But in the 19th century, the 17th century garden was changed, transformed into the new site.
That's right.
So what I wish to do is, and this is my headache in a way, and maybe also a large discussion in Rosendal and with everyone visiting this site, to bring back some of the original, because the layout is still there, the wall is gone from the 17th century garden, but we could move in some of the content of the 17th century into the formal garden. But now we have the rose garden there. But the rose garden is something you, at least some visitors, expect in Rosendal, which is the Valley of the Roses, right? So there's a narrative there that is conflicting with our historical sources and what we wish or know or we should do with the site. So it is a process. It is a process of changing ideas, challenging existing. Yeah.
No, but it's an important. It's a very tricky question, because it's the same here at Potager du Roi in Versailles. There are two gardens on top of each other. There is one that is the garden of King Louis XIV, but there is another interesting garden on top, which is a 19th century garden, which was completely different. And then, okay, what kind of let's say, could you keep something of both of them? That's a very tricky question. Very interesting, but it's good because that can create discussions with visitors, and that can create discussions for congresses.
And I guess, I mean, this is something we see in history too, that these kind of ideas of what to preserve, how to change former layers and so on. This has also changed. I mean, also earlier there was an expectation that these types of, it's a museum there, right? It is a kind of exhibition for something that you should visit. So, and earlier there was an expectation that it should be more ornamental, nice looking, nice smelling garden, right? But not these kind of vegetables and roots and but this has changed a lot. So I think this is something that we also see in our work very good, that at least in Norway since the pandemic, this has really made a difference, that they focus on local food, food production, and also that you have also these more community gardens again in cities and so on. I think this is something that is in common for all over the world now since then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Other questions? Oh. So what's your next project in the garden? Your next important project?
Planting fruit trees, it's one. Also finding the right types or varieties we wish, and start planting this, because this takes time. And then we really have to do something with these walls that I showed you, because they are on the way down. So we have to secure them and really make an effort there, and this costs a lot. So that means we have to think about how to finance it, and how to make it divide that in smaller projects, so that we can that it is realistic for the budgets.
So, and this the fruit trees, you will plant them along the walls. So
That's the next step then. Yes.
Yes.
But first we have to stabilize the whole construction, because it is not that good anymore. And then we still have lots of things to do with maintaining or upgrading actually all the paths in the park. And because of this, what I mentioned, heavy rains coming now more frequently, so we have some climate change issues here that we have to solve or to face.
Right. Yeah, Lucy?
Now, as Annegret was just talking about paths and rain, I noticed that Joachim and Viola were smiling. I wonder whether any of the restoration work you've done at Gunnebo's proved good or less good since the restoration there.
I'm sorry, I didn't really get the question.
So Annegret was talking about thinking about putting paths back into the gardens now as the next project. So some of the hard landscaping features, and I know at Gunnebo you've obviously done a lot of that in the restoration there. And with different or more rain, different climate conditions, whether what you've done at Gunnebo has been successful so far.
Well, we can see that we have a couple of problems. We have done a lot, and we have a lot of experiences now from 30 years of reconstructions and kind of developing this visitor garden with a lot of visitors coming here for good and for bad. So what we see with the historic materials and the reconstructions here is that it's really hard with the extreme weather because of especially when the rainy conditions, the heavy rains that we get now, they wash away the pathways, and so we have a lot of extra work because of that. So that's something we have to address sooner or later. Climate adaptations to climate change. How do we safeguard the historical garden, and how do we have to change materials, or do we have to make adjustments in the hard landscaping in the garden to address this? So that's one issue, and then we have we have a lot of traffic coming into we have the restaurant in the center of the historical estate is in the center of the garden. So and when they transport the material, the things that we don't grow in the garden, when all the transportation to the restaurant, that's also problematic, especially to the trees, because you get compactation, and so we have several problems related to being a visitor garden with a lot of visitors today, and also to climate change. So and in some ways we have been successful. In some cases things work well, and in some other cases we have to make adjustments. Yeah.
Okay, we are reaching close now to the end. Is Eric Jackson still with us? Eric, are you around? Do you hear me? Yes. Okay, so what I would like really is to thank you very much, both teams, because it was very interesting to see these two examples from Scandinavia. Well, one thing I find interesting is the cautiousness you have in preparing the future, or this kind of step by step approach. That's a thing that appeared in both your presentations.